I'm Jana. I'm working for a global citizen and non-governmental organization and with a headquarters in New York, and I'm conducting some interviews for us and the Human Rights Film Festival in Berlin. So a pleasure to have you. I would like to start with a question around your film and the beginning of your film, actually, and the beginning of From Here. There's a quote stating, "You only are free when you realize you belong to no place, you belong to every place." And I really thought about that a lot, and actually that's why this is my first question. So what did you choose that quote, and what does it mean to you?
Well, certainly we started with the quote to get people thinking a little bit and questioning their assumptions. And around belonging, I think there are a lot of assumptions about who does and does not get to belong and what it means and how it's attached to a place, whether it's a place that you were born or a place that your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents hailed. And so immediately throwing that question into people's minds before they started watching the stories, just to allow them to wonder a little bit about, what do I assume about this topic, and what would it mean to belong nowhere? What would it mean to belong everywhere? We all belong here, and at the same time, none of us own it. None of us are entitled to everything. No one gets to, in my opinion, on a deeper level, decide who else is entitled or isn't entitled. We're all equally entitled to share this living cosmos that we are part of. We get very, very used to settling into the categories around, especially around citizenship, that do not get questioned, that certain people do get rights and certain people don't get rights, and certain people do belong in a certain place and other people don't. And I absolutely don't believe that, and think that's a really important question to throw out as people started to watch the film.
I was wondering, what was your intention and the idea behind this movie? I know that you have made movies of that kind and around social justice for a longer time, but why did you exactly choose that kind of topic? And yeah, why did you also choose this protagonist?
Yeah, there's so many threads that came together to lead me to make From Here. Some of them are very personal parts of my own story, and some of them were things that were happening politically in the world, and some of them were the luck of the universe that brought me to Berlin, for example. So I've been interested in really how can we dismantle systemic racism in the United States since I became an activist as a teenager. So that was something I was grappling with, both because of my activist work and also because of growing up as part of a multi-generational immigrant diaspora community, the Greek American community in the US. As part of my own journey, I spent some time living in Greece, trying to understand my own relationship to my history and my roots, and what role that would play in my ability to make change in the country that I grew up in, the United States. And while I was there, I encountered really intense anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia and racism in Greece against immigrants and refugees there, and actually got to firsthand be mistaken as a immigrant from the Balkans because of the accent I had or the grammatical mistakes I was making with my Greek. And it was, I think, a really a unique opportunity to really look at all the assumptions I had about the quote-unquote motherland where I came from, to be then treated mistaken as a sort of invader, imposter from somewhere else. And it gave me an impulse to really think about global migration and not just the issues that were happening that I was more connected to in the US. And in the US, we were experiencing, this was, early 2000s, both the way that the Bush administration had turned immigration into a national security issue after 9/11, and decades of without immigration reform, where millions and millions of people were not able to adjust their citizenship, even though they were, or their legal status, even though they were instrumental to building the economy and keeping our economy afloat. So there was a major immigrant rights movement that was building in the US, and I became very interested in what was also happening parallelly in Europe. So I think both the movements for justice of the immigrant communities in Europe and the US, and also the movements on the right that were looking to use immigrants as a scapegoat. I was interested how those things were happening in parallel and what the conversation could be between the two continents. And then I had the opportunity to come to Berlin on a fellowship from Humanity in Action, and I thought maybe Berlin is the place to partner with New York, which was where I was living. And Berlin just sort of chose me. I started putting out the idea, and it was the 2006 when I started putting out this idea. Integration legislation had just passed in Germany, and how this word was being used to me was very problematic, and it was not being questioned in the public discourse in the same way that it has been since. So I started just talking to people, what would you think about working on a project like this with a critical perspective about these debates, and really focusing on young people and how young people are challenging our ideas of national identity, are bridging these conversations, have impulses and insight that are needed.
And as you said, the film is a lot about belonging, and you also mentioned that you questioned this belief system in belonging or not belonging to a certain place or country or whatever. Mm-hmm. But that's a topic that's going on for so long and still exists, that people, feel like they have the right to live in a country, or feel like others don't have the right to live in that country. So why do you think this is still the case?
I mean, for one thing, I think our political systems have not caught up with reality, and we are in an evolutionary moment where we're being called as a human species to radically evolve, honestly, quickly, in order to be able to address the global challenges we're facing. And I'm speaking certainly of climate change, but I think we know that climate change is intimately connected to, our system of racial capitalism, which has pushed us into the state of climate change. We're not going to be able to solve climate change without addressing the economic model that we've chosen. Citizenship has been one of the ways that system has controlled itself, who's allowed to be where, what kind of rights they're allowed to have, who's allowed to participate in the political process. So I think we're in an evolutionary moment where, if we want to survive as a species, honestly, we have to be able to think more creatively about how we protect one another's collective belonging, and not just collect certain groups of peoples that we feel that we're closest to.
So you said before that you have lived in New York, you have lived in Berlin too, so these are basically the two cities that are part of the film, and that's probably also kind of the reason why you choose them. But I also wondered, in terms of what's similar and what's different, do you see any differences in terms of discrimination, racism, how, both of them are big cities, but how that is different, and what they have in common?
When I first came to Berlin, I was actually surprised by how similar it was to the US. And I think it was the first time I had really spent that much time in Western Europe, and recognized how deeply German culture has influenced United States culture. Our histories of racism are intimately connected. So racism didn't just pop up in the United States and pop up in Germany. I mean, the colonial project, Europe's colonial project basically created the categories of race that we are still grappling with today. They were, pseudoscientific. They tried to find various justifications for how they could become real, and then that whole legacy came to the Americas very quickly and was built upon. So our eugenics movements in the United States and Germany were literally intellectually sharing the same pseudoscientific foundation. And so there's no way, I think, to talk about racism in Europe and the US as if they have two different legacies. They have absolutely the same legacy. But then there's particularities about how they have played out. And of course, the United States has it's played out in a different way around, chattel slavery and around the genocide of indigenous peoples. Germany has its own history of genocide, its own, minority groups who have been around, like the Roma people, for hundreds and hundreds of years, who continue to be ignored in the conversation. So, and Sinti people. So, yeah, in terms of how it plays out in daily life, one of the things that was really incredible to me when I first got to Germany was, so not to be able to use the word racism or talk about racism was really hindering the work of a lot of people who were trying to be able to address how it was happening in Germany. That was not the case in the U.S. We had, generations of struggle for Black liberation and a lot of language around how to talk about what was going on. And yet the problems are so deeply entrenched. It's not that having the language does it all. So I could get more specific, but I think that more than talking about how different they are, which is certainly something that's interesting, I think it's more important to draw how similar they are and how the intellectual legacy and even the far right in both continents continues to share and build their power together, that it's really a shared movement.
What I found really interesting about this film is that you had these four protagonists who were sharing their stories, and they were so different in a sense, but at the same time they went to like a very similar struggle. And I mean, this was now in New York and Berlin, but it feels like it could have been anywhere. And I was just wondering again, why did you actually pick this four persons?
I was fascinated by them, and in truth, I was fascinated by many people who we had the privilege to interview as we were searching for the protagonists. And so it was really a combination of both who the individuals were, what was happening in their life, and how they complemented each other. So I was really looking for four very different people who were all sort of breaking boundaries and crossing borders in their daily lives and also in their visions of what it means to belong. So I was interested in people who were questioning and pushing the boundaries. So I'll give an example. Tania, who's in the film, if you have a chance to watch it, she's in the film. She's undocumented. That means she came to the U.S. as a 4-year-old, and despite attempting to go through the legal immigration system, was denied citizenship and was living in the United States, which was her home, without papers. And what attracted her to me was not just that she was undocumented and she was in a struggle, because she certainly was, but it was her willingness to talk about her own life experience as being somebody who feels borderless. And then I learned about her incredible activism and how she was on the streets, on a blowhorn saying, "I'm undocumented and unafraid," which is incredibly bold and incredibly dangerous, honestly. But what initially attracted to me was that creative spirit of seeing herself beyond kind of rigid binary categories.
So the film obviously is about an issue you care about, and you had probably a lot of questions you put in this film you wanted to get answers to, and I just wondered, what is like the answer you were looking for? What do you think like the film, what do you want to achieve with that film basically?
Well, those are two different things. I think the answers I was looking for and what I want to achieve with the film are slightly different. I mean, as I said, I was grappling very much with how do you have a relationship to your ancestral identity that can be like liberatory and not be about sort of getting stuck in oppressive traditions, but also actually giving wings to our aspirations to create human flourishing. What is really important to me, what became my aim for the project, was really to give models and examples of people who were living that kind of liberation in their daily lives, because there are millions of who grow up in immigrant families and communities, and the representation of their experience and stories is often very negative, very racist, very flat, very one-dimensional. I was really looking to give voice to that story and that experience because there's so much power there. Yeah, that's what I want. I want people who rarely see their stories on the big screen to have their stories represented in a way that's nuanced and rich. And then beyond that, I'm hoping that people see and can think about migration in a deeper way and belonging in a deeper way, and feel compelled to also stand in solidarity with people who are forced to migrate all over the world every single day. So even though this film isn't about people who are right now stuck, in a refugee camp somewhere, it's about migration and belonging in a big enough way, I hope, that can draw those issues together. And I do believe that, the far right in Europe and the US has used migrants and refugees as a major political organizing tool. And if those who want any kind of progressive change are to win anything, we have to actually stand up for migrants and stand up for refugees and understand why our destinies are interdependent with each other. And so this is an issue for everyone, whether they feel personally connected or not. This is an issue for all of us who believe in justice and want to see a better future for our world. Yeah.
And my last question would be a bit around politics. I was just wondering, I mean, it's kind of obvious that there are elections in the US in November. So what is your kind of hope, not only for the elections, but for the future in the US? What do you think needs to change and should change?
Yes, we have been in a very, very difficult political moment in the United States the last years, and I think that not just the United States, in many parts of the world, and are definitely terrified that 4 more years could do irreparable damage, not just to the rights of millions of people in this country. So, what are my hopes for the future? I mean, we are also in a very hopeful moment. We have seen potentially the biggest social movement of this nation's history in the last months emerging. There's been more people on the streets over and over every single day showing up and standing up. And it's certainly a rallying cry against state violence and against police killing. But it's also, I think, a cry for a much bigger aspiration to build a country based on the values of care and cooperation and transformation, and not just on punishment and violence. So I am hopeful that millions of people through this horrible last few years have been pushed to a point of really wanting to make the kind of changes that felt impossible even a few years ago. We have conversations happening about abolishing the prison system, abolishing the policing system as we know it. And I'm incredibly inspired that that is happening on a wide scale, and that we actually get to talk about what would that mean? What would it mean to not criminalize millions and millions of people in this country, and try to think about how to deal with conflict and mental health and all kinds of things in different ways besides locking people up and using violence against them.
Thank you so much, Christina, for taking the time and speaking with us. It was really inspiring. And also thanks for doing such a great documentary.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and for your great questions.